I'm Leela Gandhi, Director of the Pembroke Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the 2025-26 Pembroke Publics Lecture, delivered by Judith Butler. The Pembroke Center's public lectureship is our highest honor and citation. It's typically conferred on exceptional individuals whose work in any sphere, from academia to activism and well beyond, contends with issues of gender and sexuality in a transformative manner. Judith Butler doesn't need another citation. It's a huge privilege that they have accepted ours. Judith Butler's work convenes multiple constituencies and disciplines around multiple dazzling and breakthrough figures of thought. Gender performativity, performative iteration, insubordinate kinship, primitive censorship, precarious subjectivity, ethics of grievability, phenomenality of signification, the confessional phantasmic nature of anti-gender ideology, to name but a few. The Judith Butler to whom I return in times of trouble, the gender trouble of this dreadful historical moment included, does all of this work by transforming the sometimes punitive and regulatory materialism of the modern Western philosophical tradition into the most unexpected resource of consolation. A consolation of philosophy, Boetius called it in the year 524, meaning philosophy can console us for being finite, for being mortal. Butler goes one step further. They use philosophy alchemically to turn every aspect of our finitude into the best part of us. One, Butler's material existential phenomenological world is not an unforgiving limit case. It is the reliable substance that binds us, holds us, withstands us in our shared grievability with others. We cannot fall out of this world. Two, they tell us that when the going gets tough, we don't need transcendental signifiers outside and beyond the system, a non-contemporaneous theological conception of God, a categorical and abstract conception of the law. Instead, we can trust the infinite permutation of worldly components, biological sex and gender included. We can trust the immanent disposition of these components to rearrange, reassemble. We can count on their capacity to be constituted differently. We must tend these capacities. Three, and Butler tells us this over and again, with increasing urgency, any attempt to arrest the capacity of entities to reassemble iteratively violates the core consolations of the world. Any attempt to name, fix, brand, settle once and for all, e.g. as Hindus, Muslims, Jews, men, women, citizens, illegals, reveals a force of stasis and of the state and of the injustice of the state. In essence, we must resist this force. Judith Butler was inducted into the consolations of philosophy at the age of 14 by a rabbi from their local synagogue. They attended Bennington College, Yale University, including a Fulbright scholarship to Heidelberg University, 1979. They were appointed the Maxine Elliott Professor of Rhetoric and Comparative Literature at the University of California, Berkeley, in 1998, where they are Distinguished Professor in the Graduate School, in addition to holding the Hannah Arendt Chair at the European Graduate School. They have served as president of the MLA and on the board of Jewish Voice for Peace. They have received the Andrew Mellon Award for Distinguished Academic Achievement in the Humanities, the Adorno Prize from the City of Frankfurt, the Brudner Prize from Yale University. They were named the Albertus Magnus Professorship by the City of Cologne. They have received the Catalonia International Prize from the Canton of Catalonia, then Commandment of the Order of Arts and Letters from the French Cultural Ministry. They have received 14 honorary degrees, including being made an honorary geographer by the American Association of Geographers, elected corresponding fellow of the British Academy, made a member of the American Philosophical Society, elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. I haven't finished. They have delivered the Wellick Lectures at Irvine, the Carpenter Lectures at the University of Chicago, the Watts Lecture at the Nobel Museum in Stockholm, the Gauss Lectures at Princeton, the Messenger Lectures at Cornell, the Tanner Lectures at Yale University, the annual Freud Lecture at the Freud Museum in Vienna. Butler's unique voice, at once rigorous, recreational, demanding, exhilarating, has accompanied us for decades across an extraordinary corpus of works. Subjects of Desire, Gender Trouble, Bodies That Matter, Excitable Speech, The Psychic Life of Power, Antigone's Claim, Frames of War, Parting Ways, The Force of Nonviolence, What World Is This, and Who's Afraid of Gender? They are one of the great philosophers of the 20th and 21st centuries, and also, perhaps more importantly, amongst the most courageous. It is a privilege to be their contemporary. Please join me in welcoming Judith.
Well, thank you very much. I now understand why I'm so exhausted. I only became more exhausted listening to that list and realizing what you failed to include. No, but seriously, that was a very generous introduction. And indeed, this invitation is both welcome and generous. I'm pleased to be back at Brown, where I have many colleagues with whom I've been in contact for many years, and especially pleased to be speaking for and with the Pembroke Center, which has, as you know, been the center of intellectual life for many of us for decades. I threw away my paper, and I wrote a different one for you, but I think the title still works. So we're just going to give it a try. And if you don't like it and you want to stay an extra hour, I'll take the other one out. Okay. In Kafka's The Trial, two men arrive in Joseph K.'s bedroom to announce his arrest. But it's unclear whether they work for a firm or are acting in the capacity of the police. Something similar happens in the Metamorphosis when Gregor Samsa, having awakened in non-human form, an enormous and uncanny insect, Ungeheuer, which is also the word Kant uses for the sublime, cannot make his way easily through the bedroom door. He's eventually confronted by men from the office who enter his home and want to know why he's late to work, and then they fire him. In the name of what authority do these men operate? And in fact, my new title for this paper is, Who Are These Men Anyway? The blending of managerial and police functions causes confusion, raising the question of who these designated authorities and actors actually represent. In the trial, Kay had done nothing more than call for his breakfast with a bell, a usual routine. But then one of the men entered his room as if in response to the bell, looking like a Reiseanzeiger, someone who dispenses information about travel or handles one's tickets. That impression was drawn from the coat he wore, black, with various clasps and belts and pockets, even a girdle or a holster that appeared very practical, though it remained thoroughly unclear what aim all of this was supposed to serve. Kay asks who they are. Wer sind Sie? Who are you? But the man in the dark coat deflected the question and responded rather to the bell he rang. You called? He asks. Why was this man responding to the call? Anna is supposed to bring him his breakfast. Kay had called for breakfast, but the man enters instead of breakfast, as if it was the man for whom he called. What kind of call was that, seemingly ambiguous, that could bring forth a foreboding stranger into his room? Kay clearly did not call for this man who intrudes, unbidden, into his space. Kay asks him who he is, and the man replies that it was you, Kay, who called. Granted, Kay did ring a bell. But if usual conventions were to hold, it would be Anna who steps into the room bearing breakfast. But now the man calls out that Kay wants his breakfast, as if his is the voice authorized to make that request, but that proves fully ineffective. The man entered the room without any clear authorization or purpose, clearly against Kay's will. Hearing a noise, Kay wonders who's in the next room and how many of them there might be. Kay again asks after his breakfast, at which point the man simply announces the state of affairs. That would be impossible. Kay then springs from the bed, insists that he be able to demand of the owner of the house how this disturbance, this incursion was possible, and endeavors to find out what rights of supervision these men have over him. What is their Beaufsichtigungsrecht? Their right to look over him, keep watch, track his movements. They are supervisors, but is this work or is this another kind of surveillance? The day is not unfolding as days should. He has been denied his food. They have entered his room, but on what authority? One asks whether he would prefer to sit somewhere. One of them asks whether he would prefer to sit somewhere rather than stand, and Kay responds that he wants neither to sit there nor to be spoken to in this way. He wants only that the man addressing him represent himself. Kay expects not only that the man will say on what authority he acts, but who has delegated authority to him. Again, the stranger turns away from the question posed and says only that he has good intentions. And when Kay enters the next room and sees a second man, he learns not only that the first man is called Franz, he's taken his name, an ironic allegory perhaps about authorship. The strange figure in the novel has Kafka's first name and may be, in fact, one of Kafka's own proxies, since now there's Franz watching over Kay, an abbreviation of Kafka's patronym, never fully articulated, as if the non-disclosure at issue resides in the name itself. The distribution of the authorial name in the text itself becomes important when we consider that Kay rang that bell, a solicitation exploited by the men, implying that Kay did invite them, though unknowingly. The two men declined to let him appeal to the host of his guest house to understand how this disturbance and incursion has taken place. They explain that he is verhaftet. In German, to be verhaftet is to be apprehended. Sometimes it means put into prison, arrested or confined as a result of a judicial writ. Haften, to seize. Verhaften, to seize away, or to seize possibly in a mistaken way, to pull off track. It implies that those who seize someone in their home or on the street are authorized to do so by a judge. It is usually a police action authorized by one or several criminal statutes. The court is operating in the background. But these men, only called watchers or even observers, Wächter, present no documents to that effect. They are simply stating what is the case. They are describing a process to which they themselves are partial outsiders. They do not state the crime for which he is verhaftet, nor do they advise him of his rights, such as anything you say may be used in a court of law, etc., nor do they check that he has understood such words. They do not exercise a speech act that makes happen what it names on the basis of the conventional authority that they have. No, they simply state that this is the way things are, as if making a train announcement or describing the weather. They are observers, not only of K, but of the entire state of affairs, not exactly authorized agents whose actions make things happen. When K asks for what reason he has been apprehended, the men simply reply that they are not in a position to say, and that he will learn all that in time. Whatever their position is, it does not imply stating the reason for a detention. And when K asks how long this waiting to know the reason, this kind of strange trial will last, he again receives evasive replies. They will seize his belongings as well, it turns out. K asks, what kind of men are these? Of what are they speaking? To which industry do they belong? K expects legal protocol, and his expectation of procedure indicates he is radically unprepared for its absence or perversion. He still supposes that he lives in a state ruled by law where incursions, seizures, and detentions have to be authorized and performed by designated authorities, only with the approval of a court that such actions can be appealed, and if found to be unjustified, prosecuted accordingly as criminal acts. In the world K supposes and expects, there are rules and procedures and public trust, and they depend upon the justification and just application of all of these. In the world that K expects, all the laws are known and communicable. They apply equally to all people, and the designated authorities are bound by the laws they claim to represent to transparency and accountability, and they can cite those laws on the occasion of their application and announce the authority by which they act and show documents that justify their actions. In this case, however, it's unclear whether those men are in fact designated authorities and what law, if any, they represent. When K asks, exasperated, how this invasion of his own apartment is possible, he demonstrates his continuing belief in a world in which private space is protected against unwanted incursions and disturbances such as these. But that world is either gone or fading. His questions reach for a lost world. These men, perhaps rogue authorities or low-level management, understood it as their right to walk through his door and arrest his life. Of course, Kay wonders if these men are from the police or if they just represent a kind of authority only reminiscent of the police echoes, as it were, unrooted from conventional authority, reproducing gestures that once operated differently in another world. They are not brandishing guns. Kay asks to what industry or firm they belong, implying that they are probably paid for what they do, but are not exactly public officials. Something appeared to him as just not right, incongruous with his own expectations of authority. He considered that the whole scene might be a great joke played upon him, maybe linked to his 30th birthday, which was that very day. This was a kind of pantomime. Maybe his colleagues at the bank set this all up. Maybe they thought that he needed only to look these observers, these guards, in the face to laugh, to see the joke, and that they would be joining him in the laughter soon. He speculates further. Maybe these men are just temporary laborers from the street corner looking for tasks, or street cleaners. They didn't look dissimilar to them. At one point, he sees Anna with the breakfast outside the door, unable to enter. He asks why she cannot come in, and one of the guards says she is not allowed to, sie darf nicht. Her function is also arrested. But as Kay starts to ask questions about the jurisdiction in which they were, how he could be detained or arrested in his place of residence and on what grounds, the guards finally respond, "We are not going to answer such questions." When Kay responds, but you must answer them. Here are my authorized documents, meine Legitimationspapiere. Show me yours, and above all, show me the order to arrest me. One guard responds, du lieber Himmel. Literally, you precious heaven. You dear heaven. Of course, in colloquial German, it's more like, good God. But the literal version insists itself here. Kay's expectations of justice are otherworldly in this context. On the one hand, Kay's vain hope that everyone will proceed according to established and fair laws is exposed as a ridiculous and naive supposition, one that will always be disappointed. On the other hand, something heavenly or precious, or both, is to be found in Kay's avid belief that everyone should act in accord with the law and that the law should be a just law, one that serves justice. The guard says that Kay is not in any situation to pursue such matters, and that it makes no sense to bother the guards, who, after all, are the ones standing closest to him among all his neighbors and colleagues. He describes them, the guard describes them as Mitmenschen, right? The people who are with you. They seem to arrest him, but they don't take him anywhere. There are no shackles. They have no judicial writ, no demonstrable authority. Yet Kay somehow accepts the authority of their words without putting up much of a fight. He has questions, of course, but he doesn't exactly defy them. Is Kay bending to bullies or rogues who came in off the street? Or are these really officials acting according to some law or some version of law? They seek to defeat his questions without answering them, break his critical spirit, or perhaps it is Franz who seeks to seize and break Kay, who is, quite literally and already, a diminished or abbreviated version of Kafka. They regard Kay's desire to know things as childish. They laugh at his questions about authority as if they were funny academic niceties. Does he wish to expedite his trial, they ask, so that then he can sit around with them and discuss matters like legitimation? Ha, ha, ha. Apparently, in this world, the world taking hold in this novel, the world refracted within the terms of the novel, waiting to know why one is arrested, is the trial, and only after do you discuss the question of whether or not the process was legitimate. Only when it's too late do you ask that question. No questions about legitimacy need to be settled before the trial begins. The men openly admit that they do not have much power in these matters. They have no authorizing documents. Perhaps they are like him, these men who proclaim that they are the ones close to him, with him, Mitmenschen, low-level employees subject to the higher levels of an industrial authority, a Behörde, authority, agency, firm, department, office, administration. They neither know the reasons why they are assigned this job, nor what the purpose their actions serve. All they know is that their designated task is to seek out as much guilt as they can in the population. That's their task. As stipulated by law, one of them explains, our firm, as far as I can see, he says, and I know only the lowest level, he adds, is to be attracted by guilt in the people and to be sent to those sites where guilt has been sensed. That is law, he says. Das ist Gesetz. It's not a law among laws, but law itself. Kay objects, I do not know this law. A guard responds, you will come to feel it in time. Law is defined here by the situation in which guards are attracted to sites of guilt where, acting as observers, rogue workers, and lackeys, they prey upon the slightest potentials of guilt to intensify that feeling and the people's need for punishment in the form of punitive law. Hence, Kay is the one who rang that bell. They simply arrived in response. Whatever law is in this scene, it is occasioned and sustained by that guilt. The law does not respond to crime, no. Holding someone guilty for its commission on the basis of evidence, no, no. Guilt is the only evidence needed to initiate this process. What is here called the law sniffs out guilt, understood as a susceptibility to punishment, a vulnerability to punitive power, in order to build its carceral apparatus and extend its space until it is coextensive with the world itself. The men are tasked with this. But we are not sure that there's an authority who explains all this to them or gives them directions. The law is thus a predator of guilt, gluttonous and unsatisfiable, or so the logic seems to go. The law exists to feed upon a susceptibility to punishment, a fear of punishment that it intensifies by its rogue and unauthorized actions. Perhaps it's not guilt exactly, or perhaps it's not guilt alone, but rather a need of punishment on the part of the guilty, their search for a punitive authority, their desire for law. The guards are on the lookout for guilt. Guilt is looking for its punishment, a way of satisfying its sense of having committed a crime, even when there is no evidence that one has taken place. A punitive authority is still an authority, and some people cling to an authority, Kafka tells us, even when that authority is unjust, rather than live with no authority at all. In another parable, The Problem with Our Laws, the people refuse an insurrection against inequality and illegitimacy in order at least to continue to live with a law that holds them together as a people and guards against their dissolution. They cannot imagine that rising up will bind them in another way. Freud, by the way, writes about this in a short essay, The Pale Criminal. But so does Althusser when he asks why any of us turn around on the street when we hear the police say, "Hey, you there." The you could be anyone, but we turn around, assuming it's for us. What hastens that turn? The "hey, you there" is suspicious, a way of stopping a person just short of arrest. The "hey, you there" thrives for poor K. Instead of the breakfast for which he thought he was calling. It arrives, for poor K, instead of the breakfast for which he thought he was calling, depriving and punishing in its most elemental linguistic elements. Kafka's rogues are not the police, but authorities who can neither explain their mandate nor who they represent. They seek out the susceptible, those who still believe in law, or feel a moral obligation to obey the law, to instill fear, to keep them scattered and on edge, knowing some kind of punishment is coming, or that it already has, but for what? Most probably a slander, Kay remarks. Someone said something false about him, whether he had been maligned or betrayed, for he could recall no criminal act on his part. Perhaps, we might speculate, he has been called a domestic terrorist or enemy of the state. Maybe he is accused of violent intentions he has never considered, a threat to the state of another kind. Maybe he is a Jewish person who stands for justice only to be called an anti-Semite. Who knows? Maybe he's a Palestinian or an ally opposing genocide as a crime against humanity, only to find that his freedom of speech is being criminalized, or to find on the way to the grocery store one is abducted and seized away to be purged from the nation state, or that one's friend has vanished. Where? The text, of course, says none of these things. The text does speculate, however, that there was some inchoate guilt exploited by these authorities in the name of law, seized upon to start to build criminalization. An internal cage, perhaps, in which one longs for and fears a punishment for a crime that seems to have no specificity other than the life that is one's own. An existential guilt, perhaps, or an unconscious attachment to law. There need be no crime for which he felt guilty, only an abiding guilt understood as a susceptibility to punishment, a fear that punishment is coming, that it's coming for him, and for some reason he cannot explain. How many of us live with that feeling? Perhaps, indeed, a punishment will be for a desire he could not recall, or for a nonconformity he could not fully regulate. One can only speculate. The law only needed to smell or sense that guilt that persists indifferent to any possible action undertaken, all crime, to seize upon it and start to build the apparatus of detention. For detention must be what one deserves, but why? If it is logical that someone must be responsible for this arrest or detention, this home invasion, the seizure of possessions, this refusal of nourishment, this loss of employment, does it follow that it must be K himself? If K cannot discover any reason in the world for his apprehension, could it be that he himself is the reason? Has he entered into that scene of responsibilization that holds the subject accountable for the very conditions that arrest and defeat his actions? Will he continue to question what passes as the law, or will his self-doubt become corrosive in time? Will his naive faith in the law's ability to deliver justice, be confirmed or perpetually refuted? He wants to follow directions because he believes in directions and that they are useful and good, but no direction leads to any answers to the kinds of questions he has raised. The trial of waiting for the answer plays out in the pages that follow as he continues to look to or for authorities who turn out to be either corrupt or as clueless as he is. At the end of this opening scene, the lost, disempowered, petty, and corrupt character of these designated authorities becomes clear. They admit that they too would like to be free men. and then they offer a deal makers, all of us. For a bit of money, they will go to the nearby coffee house and get poor K some breakfast. Is he interested? No. I began my lecture this way to demonstrate that Kafka's texts pose fundamental questions about how law works, whether it can work at all, and what happens when the law is differentially applied, serves inequality, occupation, or carceral aims, when legal means are used for repressive purposes, or when access to the law is blocked by the law, and how the law functions as a spatial and temporal form of detention, bringing about suffering and injustice. Fundamental questions of equal access to the law, the designated authorities of law enforcement, just and unjust punishment, due process, habeas corpus, legal violence, and the relation of law to justice are all elaborated by Kafka's fictional theorizations. Fictional, but not for that reason false. They are fictional because, as Hannah Arendt makes clear, they are experiments in time and place. Kafka's fiction does not directly replicate the law, but demonstrates the narrative dimension of legal processes, specifically the resurgent anticipation that law will be just or lead to justice. And yet the narrative never unfolds into a progressive sequence. Expectation surges and is checked time and again. What emerges instead are those convoluted and unsatisfying narrative forms that drive and undermine the expectation that justice will be brought about by law. They are often small or halting forms that hold the expectation and its impossibility together at the same time without resolution. By the way, a different kind of hope emerges after humans, naively and ardently, suffer the deteriorations of perpetually renewed false hope. Its dimension is both small and infinite, knowable only beyond the carceral framing of the human form in space and time. In Kafka, the anti-carceral impetus, its implicit abolitionism, is where an impractical hope reconfigures the horizons of justice, prompting the question, what might justice still be? Through what spatio-temporal coordinates can it be imagined? He calls it a small, nonsensical hope, and it appears in almost every parable and story, though often at the margins, or in a comedic moment, or in brief glimpses of infinity, light that passes infinitely under a shut door, human objects tripping eternally down the steps, human figures reduced to abbreviations or simple lines, relieved of gravity and the perils of embodiment. They do not take us to an afterlife, but fold impossibility into the literary form where it retains its impossible vibrancy. Indeed, in our times, authoritarianism is becoming normalized and indefinite detention, so central to Kafka's legal fictions, has become the most common carceral norm in the world. According to the UN Office on Drugs and Crime in 2023, more than 3.7 million people are held in pre-trial detention, a good third of the total number of imprisoned people in the world. Due process and habeas corpus are sidelined by immigration policies or destroyed as legal norms as deportations are carried out in the US by hired thugs who seem to be working for the state but are largely untrained. At the end of the trial, Kay seeks to avoid a death sentence, bounding outside the city, chased by the police, or were they just hired thugs? He does not know. He cannot tell the difference, and we as readers cannot say which one they are. He is murdered like a dog. Kay is never held in prison or a detention center, but his life becomes a form of indefinite detention, allegorizing the spatial reach of its normalization. He moves through the world accused and apprehended under arrest. The expanse of the world is coextensive with carceral space. Moreover, where one might find the law that can be trusted, the one that carries the promise of justice, that becomes an open-ended question, an anguished cry, since it seems not to reside consistently in the expected space of the court, or in the process of the hearing, or in the moment of considered judgment. If we cannot find justice in the designated legal spaces or processes, where might we look for it? In what space and in what time? If we seek recourse to the law to rectify injustice, but law in its specific forms is already in the service of injustice, we are then stopped in our tracks or detoured, having lost our way. Indeed, when the law is engaged in criminal activities, or when it becomes a criminal regime, and when those designated to represent the law use it as an instrument for profit, self-aggrandizement, or political repression, are then the only options to become criminals in the eyes of that law, or provisional anarchists until a just order or way of life can commonly be brought into being. A critical relation to any legal regime requires passing through an anarchist moment which frees us to imagine the law undone or redone. Those are not moments of compliance. Those are not moments of compliance. Otherwise, we take for granted forms of law that need to be rethought, especially when they become instruments of violence, dispossession, and rights stripping. When asked to follow the law, it is assumed that we know what the law is and can judge whether or not it is legitimate. If the text of the law is inaccessible or cannot be read, or if it is allegedly kept in a sequestered place to which only a few have access, how can one abide by the law? Its inaccessibility makes potentially criminal all those obligated to follow the law under such conditions. If we are asked to follow a set of laws from which we've been excluded, whose protections and powers of enfranchisement we lack, we come to know only the forcible effect of law, but not its enabling powers. If a set of laws, or arguably a legal regime, is based on exclusion, would it not be just to demand a different form of law? If a group of people are said to act in the name of the law, what gives them the authority to do so? If, as they claim, they were designated to do so, by whom were they so designated, and with what authority was that designation made? If one is subject to laws one does not or cannot know, if they're written in a language one cannot read, or if the laws change in the course of their sporadic application, or if those tasked with implementing laws start to make their own rules and laws, or if one is detained, confined, caged, punished, pushed, or beaten, given an unpayable fine, expelled from a territory without cause or redress, then the operations of law serve injustice, and the sphere of law is separated indefinitely from the sphere of justice. If knowledge of the law is blocked, even prohibited, if recourse to the law is ruled out, then the law not only becomes inaccessible and unknowable, but for those very reasons unjust. And if we need law to secure our lives, and we're devastated by legal codes and processes at the same time, Or if life comes to depend upon a shifting and inscrutable law or legal system no one can follow, then the problem of gaining access to law proves not only to be an epistemological quandary, but a matter of existential urgency. If incarceration or deportation are the punishments for not complying with the law, but the conditions for compliance are absent or non-existent, then one is not or no longer in a position to follow the law, which means that the inaccessibility of the law or its arbitrary or targeted implementation by designated authorities produces a field of unavoidable criminality and terror for those targeted by the law. Kafka transmutes that terror into an uncanny sense of everyday life. One is not or is no longer the kind of subject who can follow the law, since one has been excluded from the very definition of the subject entitled to know the law by which one is governed. But if one is apprehended by the law and obligated to follow the law, even though one does not know what it is or where to find it, or even what it would mean to follow, then one is already, before any effort at compliance, in a kind of prison, in a kind of trial, seeking access to the law within a closed circuit of perpetually defeated pursuit. In such a situation, the law takes on a spatial and ineffable quality. Seeking to enter its domain becomes equivalent to staying and dying in place, which is, of course, what happens to the man from the country in Before the Law. From the start, this carceral space frames the question of how to gain entrance to the law. Already defeated, subdued, and contained, the prison precedes the question of how to enter the law, for the law is already figured as a closed space guarded. In this sense, one is already entered as one asks the question of how to enter the law, how to get asylum, how to gain legal documents, defeated in advance by the presuppositions of the question. When the law is first and only registered as a threat, a bar, an exclusionary power, a punitive power, then the question of entry is actually a question of exit. If one finds oneself cast as a criminal before the law, then breaking free of the law is the same as a jailbreak, the only pathway to freedom and to justice. When Kay in the trial is told there's an allegation against him, but that he has to go through a process to discover what it might be, he asks the representatives of the law where he can go to discover what has been alleged and to defend himself. A file was sent. It included his name. What do we know? They send him on a circuitous pathway that resembles the streets of the Jewish quarter in Prague to a building whose portals are largely impassable. The one lawyer he finds there is confused and distracted, and the procedure never really starts. He's never able to exercise his right to know with what he has been charged, who has made the charge, to present his own evidence, or indeed to receive a final decision from a judge or jury that has followed all procedures of fairness. Indeed, the trial, named by the title of the book, comes to describe the pre-trial waiting and expectation of a fair trial and a just finding that never comes. Indefinite detention in the face of an indefinitely postponed procedure, pre-trial proceedings that are never accomplished, comes to describe everyday life for Kay, who continues to expect that he may well discover what the allegation is. The usual sequence not only collapses, but inverts. The allegation is the final judgment, and the search to know the allegation, the accuser, the evidence, become the punishment. When we live in a world in which an unsupported allegation suffices to secure lifelong punishment, the legal system collapses into the kind of criminality it is meant to guard against. The inversion of legal sequence, in which punishment precedes a perpetually ambiguous procedure, in which the search for procedure itself becomes a kind of torture, and where death is finally dealt by a legal representative indistinguishable from a thug, without any death sentence except the one that has been structuring the story from the start. This last is the storyline of Kafka's The Trial, but the twist in the sequence is the one we know and have doubtless come to feel. It is the twist and torture that characterizes forms of injustice committed by the law or some branch of the law in its name and with its power including arbitrary legal violence, indefinite detention, abduction, deportation, and the destruction of constitutional and international human rights. It is the insight that takes place when one realizes the law, or some large part of it, has become criminal. An incalculable sense of alarm emerges in the face of a radically failed promise that law might furnish justice, when injustice deploys the law to further and normalize its aims. Or one makes a legal petition to gain asylum or to establish in a court of international law that crimes against humanity have been committed, say, in Gaza, genocide, only to find that the act itself is criminalized. Or one seeks to rescue ailing refugees at sea in accord with international obligations, only to be arrested as criminals or associates of terrorism. Or one shows up in the public square in its expanded digital dimension to protest genocide as an established crime, only to be apprehended as a terrorist and deported. Or the US imposes sanctions on the International Criminal Court for pursuing charges of genocide against the State of Israel, or Palestinian human rights groups for petitioning to the ICC to consider fresh charges of genocide, precisely when the most learned genocide scholars concur that a genocide has been committed, and those people are all called anti-Semites or charged with terrorism. Is it mad to make the appeal to the ICC when both the institution and the appeal will be sanctioned by a global power with interests in razing the land, deporting the people, both of which are additional crimes? It may be mad in the sense of being impractical or impossible to realize, but acting as if justice were still possible when its conditions have been destroyed is one way to keep the ideal alive, however small and nonsensical it may seem in the current scheme of things. The appeal to justice posits and imagines the world in which the appeal could be heard, even if or precisely because it cannot be found now. Perhaps we can call this radical hope, or see it as a way of taking leave of the legal status quo to show the widening gap between the law and the promise of justice. It vacates the reality principle, as it were, to give us back reality through another lens, one that condenses other temporalities in the light cast by its fictional form. The legal appeal is perhaps like the parable or the novel as a kind of extended parable, one that hardly relies on reality as it experiments with space and time. It is closer to a wild performative that resists all instruction on how best to adapt to the current reality. The relation of law and justice is vitally linked with the relation between literature and law. Promise, expectation, hope, and anticipation are all forms of imagining that are part of legal process in criminal law. A person has a certain right to expect, to know the charges, to know the evidence, to produce counter evidence, to face the one who makes the charge, to appear in person for any proceeding. These are forms of expectation. The procedures are only fulfillable through the unfolding of patterned and expected narrative sequence. In Kafka's work, the sequences are reversed. Punishment comes first, the trial is endlessly deferred, and life itself becomes an endless pre-trial administrative matter. Justice is clearly not furnished by law when, for instance, its sequential procedures fail to commence, or they reverse once they are started, so that punishment is the first moment, judgment precedes punishment, or no conclusion ever arrives and remains indefinitely deferred. Or maybe the ones responsible for administering justice cannot read the directions and do not know the rules, or they speak another language and have no translators on hand to advise the one detained why they are there and what will happen. Or perhaps the directions are lost and no longer readable because the lines have been written over so many times that only a graphic palimpsest remains, as is the case in the penal colony, where the law takes form as a brutal machine, killing at random, acting in accord with no discoverable judgment or directive, and with no one in command. The dashing of narrative expectation that justice will be achieved through the sequential operation of law characterizes Kafka's legal fictions, but surely occurs first within legal processes themselves. And yet, precisely because of that unfulfilled narrative expectation, Kafka's parables and legal fictions demonstrate a form of literature indissolubly bound to law, yet barred from compliance. Non-compliance does not rely on courage, but rather on the inability to follow the law without finding oneself detained or incarcerated from the start. The space-time of Kafka's fiction can demonstrate this within its own terms, recasting the legal sequence within a form that leaves expectations of justice in the dust. At the same time, those expectations could not be shattered or destroyed once and for all. They keep showing up in questions and demands, pressing conversations, acts of critical inquiry and dissent. In Kafka's world, the desire for justice is as implacable as is its legal defeat. But that is not the end of the story. Or rather, it may be the end of the story form, given that something entirely different emanates from the parable, a thwarted propulsion, a truncated sequence that displays itself in form as a scene beyond which another order of justice occasionally shines its light. Is all this analogous to the predicament we are in, where despite the assault on constitutional and international law, some legal decisions do uphold just principles, and the field of litigation is, as we know, intensified as an unsettled field of political conflict where at least 100 directives from this administration have been stopped or delayed? Is the parable before the law, in the parable before the law, an extract from the trial? Don't worry, I'm not going to read it. The gatekeeper who bars the man from the country from entering the law is described as acting as great man act, that is, impersonally and with indifference. That man from the country proves to be something of a rural Kantian. He arrives at the gates of the law, assuming that the law applies to everyone. The universality defines the law and its applicability. Lovely. He cannot help himself from having this naive faith and expectation, and he continues to have it, by the way, his whole life. But from where does this passionate expectation emerge? Well, our man from the country is an idealist committed to universality, willing to be one among many who are all treated equally by the law. The gatekeeper, a designated or self-designated authority, frustrates him at every turn, barring entrance into the law, leaving that man confused and waiting. It is interesting that the man never gives up his faith in the law's universality. The idea that he too would be included in the law, that the law has universal inclusion as a defining feature. We never come to know who appointed the gatekeeper who stops the man from the country from entering. And though it is stated that the gatekeeper is not a great man, he acts as if he were, claiming that he represents the law. There is no way to test that claim. But the man from the country submits to his authority. And yet, when we consider the self-proclaimed authority of the gatekeeper, we may see that he engages in impersonation or performative mimicry. We do not know who authorizes his action, and perhaps we come to suspect that he is self-authorized. He is miming the authoritative man, performatively producing credible effects, at least for the credulous, for those who still believe in law. With every assertion that blocks the man from entry, the gatekeeper becomes a larger man, hyperbolic figure of masculinity, perhaps even a member of the manosphere avant la lettre. He's like other Kafkan guards we have known. He says, "This is the law. That you may not enter the law. This is the law." Earlier, Kay was told what the law was. Remember, it's the same novel. An exploitation of guilt for the purposes of fostering compliance and expanding the authority of those designated to carry out that work. Kay does not know this law at first, and neither do his readers, but apparently we will all come to feel it in time. Indeed, if the man spends his life waiting to enter the law, even wastes away outside the gatekeeper also dedicates his life to becoming the simulacrum of the great man whose power is fully negative, blocking the entry, manifesting his capacity to represent the exclusionary law time and again. The guard never calls his boss or consults a written document. No, he exercises the law with his no. And through the iterability of that negation, he becomes the authority he is said to represent. Mimesis collapses the relation of representation, the very conceit that he is only a designated authority. That the rural man waits, however, and does not say, fuck you, I am heading through this gate or going back to the land where I'm from, shows that he believes in the law. He also desires that law, apparently more than food, more than life itself. To track the paradox through which the criminalization of those seeking to abide by the law, to track it means undertaking critical inquiry. One asks about the conditions and mechanisms through which that criminalization is produced and reproduced. It requires a perspective that stands outside the law, provisionally anarchist or criminal, in order to track its operation. The parable is another space-time from which to understand the space-time of this kind of carceral logic and to register and display its mechanism of entrapment, the lure and devastation of its false promise. And yet, as one follows the parable, coming to know its form, one is not precisely entrapped by that law, not seized or apprehended by its workings. One does feel horror or loss of hope, but usually one rails against that vision, closing the book, finding other novels. Reading a parable or legal fiction of this kind requires critical distance, introducing us to a form of criticality whose fuller actualization would be precisely noncompliance, civil disobedience, strike, or even uprising. If the laws regulating migration are written in a language to which migrants have no access, if there are no language justice translators at work, by the way, we should all be funding language justice translators, or if those laws are not fully known for some other reason, then a trap is set. The people bound by a law they do not know are deprived of the knowledge they need to comply with the law or to resist it. Lacking knowledge of the necessary conditions for compliance, they cannot possibly comply. They are now a class of the non-compliant. How can anyone even deliberate on moral or political grounds whether to follow the law? Should I follow the law? Should I not follow the law? If one is not able to discern what the law is or on what grounds it stakes its legitimacy. The paradox forms a crucial dimension of injustice that goes beyond the usual paradigms of civil disobedience. It's not necessarily unjust to break the law, nor is it always just to follow a law. We know this from resistance movements against fascism, slavery, apartheid, colonial occupation. When an existing legal code or regime publicly announces or implies that it constitutes the domain of justice, then it conflates law with justice, precluding the possibility of a critical position on the law itself. Law breaking is then a deliberate act with mindfulness about its consequences, refusing to serve in the army when military service is obligatory for moral or political reasons. The migrant, however, who's barred entry to a legal jurisdiction or found guilty of seeking to enter illegally is subject to the punishing character of a legal system, but deprived of the entitlements and powers conferred by legal citizenship. The same migrant may be following international laws in seeking to be processed at a border, but deemed criminal by another more local or national legal authority or a local administrative authority. At such moments, the migrant is subjected to two different legal codes. One establishes a right whose exercise is deemed criminal by another. That might be one version of living on the knife's edge, as Kafka described it, requiring the very law by which one is done in. There are, I believe, some implications for how we think about whether and how to follow the law. A law has to be known, has to be made available in a language that is understood, has to be upheld by legal authority, has to be the kind of law that is right to follow. When, in Hannah Arendt's terms, we exercise judgment, we ask whether or not to follow a law. If it is not this or that law, but a legal regime whose legal demands I wish to refuse, then another form of question emerges. Is the legal regime whose laws I am asked to obey a criminal regime? And am I then not obligated to refuse those enticements, the call to obedience and conformity that issues from that regime? Arendt was dismayed by those who did not want to miss out on the historical wave, who threw their lot in with the Nazi Party in the 30s and 40s in Germany. Indeed, she maintained that one cannot tell that history without considering, quote, the almost universal breakdown, not of personal responsibility, but of personal judgment in the early stages of the Nazi regime. And this, she writes, in Personal Responsibility Under Dictatorship, and I think Bonnie Honig and I agree that we must all be reading this essay now. She considers those who later say, oh, I was but a cog in a system. I did not do anything, only the system acted. She notes, there is then a next question. And why, if you please, did you become a cog or continue to be a cog under such circumstances? Why did you comply with extortion from a federal administration that is violating academic freedom and self-governance? I'm sure you've all asked this question, right? Perhaps you've asked it to people you know. She goes on later in this essay to argue that although acts of state may suspend legal systems in order to defend themselves against assault, these are questions of politics, not law. Yet, she argues, when acts of state start to introduce criminality into the legal regime, or when, in her words, there occurs complete reversal of legality, in the case of the Hitler regime, the whole state machinery enforced what normally are considered criminal activities, to put it mildly. Love her understatement. Okay. If personal judgment is the criterion by which we choose to disobey, then the I is cast as a knowing and deliberate agent. But when non-compliance becomes the aim of a social and political movement, then civil disobedience is linked less with my judgment or with yours than with judgments that we come up with together in the context of open and defiant debate in the course of making a social movement, which can happen, as we know, from the mayoral elections in New York last night. In the October 30th briefing on the destruction of Venezuelan boats, allegedly for drug smuggling, featuring government representatives who could neither produce the authorization for such acts, increasingly regarded as extrajudicial killings, nor did they know the names of the people killed by those bombs. No lawyers were present. At one point, a reporter, maybe a congressman, said, show us the authorization, the legal document that justifies this action. Had that person read Kafka? Okay. Another said, who has authorized this act? It's like, oh, stupid, naive question. The administrative representative said, your mother. Like, later we'll talk about legitimation. What do you want? What are you asking for? Why do you ask such a question? Dismissed. In a response that lets us know he has brethren in Kafka's The Trial. Case said, in response to their contempt for all questions regarding authorization and legitimation, who are these guys? We can ask the same. Okay, I see that I have asked you to be very patient with me, so I'm going to move ahead a little bit. Are you okay with the time this is taking? Oh, man. Don't you have to get to the gym? What time is it? All right, sorry. Look, a good joke can get you through. I'm trying to tell you. These are miserable times. You should find whatever comedic capacities you have. Oh, yeah. If I pass through a checkpoint that's designated for those who are seeking asylum only to be told that I have thereby entered the country illegally, then I am at once solicited by one law only to be punished by another, as I have said. In this case, the law is the ensemble of laws regulating migration and the border, a regulatory mechanism for establishing who may enter into that sphere and who may not. One problem, clearly, is that to be excluded from the law does not mean that one is free from the law, that one can escape punishment or the carceral apparatus designed to regulate the border. That form of administrative law excludes through containment, and so engages in a spatial paradox that recalls previous forms of internal disenfranchisement associated with prison systems. Those who are internally dispossessed of legal entitlements are both jettisoned from the law and subjected indefinitely to its force. When a state is a signatory to an international accord whose laws it defies, it refuses to follow a law that it has adopted for itself. In punishing the asylum seeker, for instance, the state breaks its own law and exhibits its own criminality. And yet criminality is assigned to those who act in accord with international law. So what is the law exactly? How is one to know it, much less to follow it? In Kafka's legal fictions, he points out time and again that the people require the law, even when it is unjust, because the thought of living without the law fills them with dread, a sense that they themselves will dissolve as a people. So for there to be an uprising or an effective resistance to the law, people have to imagine themselves outside the law. They even have to imagine their unity outside the law. Perhaps we can supplement Kafka's conclusion with another. Sometimes the people need the law, especially when it is unjust, in order to savor its punitive powers, especially when they are put on display. It is the guilt of the people that is exploited. Is it? Is it the guilt? Or is it the submission to which guilt leads, the vague sense that one is in need of punishment, or in externalized form that someone else is in need of punishment, so that one can see and revel in the display of punitive law, punitive powers that brings the people together, consolidating national identity in a shameless, sadistic thrill of punishment. William Martel LeBron in Boston, a defendant in a trial, was apprehended by ICE agents after the proceedings, charged with falsifying information on his driver's license. He was brought to trial. ICE agent Brian Sullivan seized away Martel LeBron after he left the courthouse. Newark Mayor Ras Baraka was on a congressional visit to an ICE facility to inspect its conditions when ICE arrested him. And what about all those people who are seeking to comply with the law by appearing at their immigration hearings as required to request legal protection or status in the United States, only to have a representative of the Justice Department or Homeland Security suddenly call for a dismissal of the case, and then once dismissed, rights of due process are effectively denied to immigrants or asylum seekers, the undocumented, and they are arrested and detained by DHS and Customs Enforcement officers, ICE, who are waiting at the courthouse without rights of counsel and without being able to say to those apprehended what crime, if any, they have committed. We have seen the footage of asylum seekers wrestled to the ground, thrown, and forced into vans. This is the law. And yet it is one law that interrupts another law or is potentially contravened by another law. Not just one law, but a vision of what law should be. The state act or policy that authorizes abduction and deportation without rights of due process is held to be more important, a national security issue that takes precedence over constitutional protections that have been conventionally afforded to non-citizens, including rights of due process. Federal courts upheld this decision, but the guards who operate as designated authorities act according to another law, one whose aim is precisely the destruction of constitutional protections. You do not know that law? You will come to feel it in time. Immigration and Customs Enforcement held more than $60,000, are holding more than 60,000 people in ICE detention, according to data current as of September 21st of this year. Migration Policy Organization reports that there were 39,000 detainees in ICE custody when Trump returned to the White House in January 2025, a number that rose to a record 61,000 in late August and could reach as high as 107,000 by January 2026, given the One Big Beautiful Bill Act's $45 billion allocation for immigration detention. The US will have the largest center for indefinite detention of migrants in the world, will become the largest center. What percentage of those were arrested at immigration courts is not yet documented, but that is because the government refuses to disclose the statistics. But the contradictory legal demands are clear: constitutional and international protections versus detention and deportation policy. American Immigration Lawyers Association points out, and I quote, that people are following the rules by appearing in immigration court as they promised when released from custody, doing exactly what the system demands of them, only to be targeted, arrested, and detained because the government has changed its mind on detention, end quote. Well, that seems true, but it's important to recognize that there are two different kinds of legal processes at work here, that they imply two different versions of what law is or should be, and that they are in conflict with one another. This is not a single government subject who has changed its mind, since many of these procedures were instituted by Obama and continued by Biden. Let's remember that. But rather, there are two minds, or two ways of understanding law in tension with one another, both of which belong to the same political field of law. Indeed, the conflict within the US has to be understood in light of international law as well. International human rights law, notably the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which the US ratified in 1992, prohibits arbitrary detention. According to international law, seeking asylum is considered a human right, and every person in the world has the right to apply for asylum if they are fleeing conflict, violence, persecution, or other serious events compelling them to leave their country and seek refuge elsewhere. In both of these international laws, the expectation of universality is communicated to everyone regardless of national origin. The law is aspirational, and it arouses expectations of justice. And yet, acting in accord with this law that enables the exercise of a right considered universal can become the crime for which one is detained by national and local law enforcement indefinitely, backed by statutes and executive decree. The man from the country, the person from outside the country, backed by international law, approaching the border or the court, expecting entry, only to find that the act of approaching the law subjects them to indefinite detention or deportation by a quite different deployment of the law. Immigration courts have become, as you know, grotesque scenes of capture, where the right to petition for legal status is suspended, overridden, or criminalized by the government's demand for what's called expedited removal. These are human beings, expedited removal. What gives that latter demand priority over the rights to petition for legal protection or status and the rights of immigrants to due process, habeas corpus, when apprehended in this way? What we apparently call the law goes this way and that. Those who oppose the policy claim this is not law enforcement, this is cruelty disguised as policy. That's from the American Immigration Lawyers Association. But ICE agents are acting in accord with policies and governmental directives themselves supported by the legal authorization of both Homeland Security and the Department of Justice. They understand themselves to be enforcing immigration and customs law, relying on over 400 federal statutes to authorize their actions. And yet, immigration law also provides for due process and the right to a hearing. We should not think that when the law is cruel, it is not law, but something else. No, the scene of cruelty is part of this operation of law. If we say that law is only what we think law should be, insisting upon a restrictively normative conception of law, we're not able to describe the legal violence that is currently underway. I'm not arguing that all law is legal violence, nor am I saying that the rule of law makes no sense as a principle. No, I am one of those who keeps hoping law will deliver justice, only to be thrown back upon a critical relation to that very narrative expectation I cannot let go of. The contradictory operations of law provide opportunities for new forms of litigation, as those undertaken against immigration courthouse arrests by ICE, for instance, by Latino Justice, PRLDEF, the American Immigration Council, and Democracy Forward in New York, quote, demanding the release of critical records the government has unlawfully withheld about arrests at immigration courts and the dismissal of immigration cases, end quote. The arrest of ICE agents for denying basic rights to those who are mid-trial pits one legal imperative against a cluster of others. The terrain of law becomes a battle for legal hegemony of one conception of law over another. On August 30th, the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU of the District of Columbia, New York Civil Liberties Union won a lawsuit, Make the Road New York v. Noam, upholding the principle that those detained have due process rights that cannot be abrogated. At stake in this standoff, however, is whether the government will abide by the judicial ruling. The answer to the question of who can rightfully represent the authority of law is usually answered by legal systems themselves. They designate judges as representatives of the law. They stipulate how one can become certified as a judge. But if the matter is solved through legal convention, what accounts for the legitimacy of legal conventions, and how are legitimate and illegitimate conventions distinguished? Perhaps there is some wise person or persons who have the answers. If so, how were they designated, and by what right? I think what we see is that there's no one ground of law, but rather an ongoing dispute over what those grounds may be, an open-ended debate in philosophy, legal studies, and jurisprudence. Whether or not that question can be adequately answered is not the primary question posed here. Perhaps the debate itself reaches beyond the time of a life. Rather, at issue is the pain of not knowing the laws to which one will be subject and without which one cannot imagine life. The problem is not only epistemological, but affective, and even under some circumstances, a matter of life or death. It is the law that one comes to feel in time. For if one is subject to laws one does not or cannot know, or if the laws change in the course of their sporadic application, or if law becomes a scene of sporadic application, or one is held in confinement, caged, punished, fined, expelled from a territory, then an injustice has clearly taken place. Okay, almost done. Sorry. If we are to sort just from unjust laws or just and unjust uses of law, then it's assumed that we first know the laws and then we sort them into different categories. But if we do not or cannot know the law, or if we cannot enter them in Kafka's sense, or if the law goes this way or that, and enforcement officials are making up law on the spot, we're not in a position to distinguish just and unjust laws because we cannot know them in advance. We can only establish that position outside the law in a sphere of justice irreducible to law. But to live there is either to engage anarchy or existential fear, civil disobedience or general strike. And if we depend on those laws to secure our life, or the question of life or death is bound up with a shifting and inscrutable law, then the problem of access is at once existential and epistemological. There has first to be sanctuary for any critical reflection on just and unjust law. That is, a space and time whose coordinates are not saturated by law. Sanctuary, perhaps the parable is a sanctuary. Perhaps for me, it's acting as a sanctuary, the space of legal fiction, that perch from which thinking and judgment becomes possible. Although we may think that these questions of language, entry, access, and distinction are preconditions for any discussion of justice, it turns out that justice flares up precisely when these questions are raised. Justice turns out to be a problem for the very question of how to follow the law. If one can neither know nor comply with the law, and life-negating punishment follows from non-compliance, then this most elemental approach to the law is already ensnared by a circular prison, a closed cell. The law takes on a spatial an ineffable quality, a form of torture, a promise of process that devolves quickly into indefinite stasis. The sequence, interrupted or reversed, becomes a scene, repeated indefinitely. As I've said, the logical constellation of the prison starts with the question of how to gain entry into the law, how to gain access to the law. The law appears first as a bar, a ban, prohibition, exclusionary mechanism. And the question of entry is from the start bound up with a law that assumes the potential or actual criminality of anyone who approaches the law. The border, the checkpoint, is already part of a carceral apparatus. In this inverted world in which criminal forms of punishment take place in the name of legal justice, certain reading practices become all the more critical, and they return us to the basic operations of literary reading: how to know, read, translate, narrate, but also how to question and think outside the framework that would normalize this legal universe. For many, there is no entry into any country without translation. If the point of entry is at once the advent of criminality, then law is already the space of the prison, or better, the detention center. The parable or the novel establishes a perspective at once internal and external to the law, at least in Kafka's case. To understand this at all, we have to follow sequence that reverses our expectations of legal narratives. The punitive law is prompted by allegedly criminal acts that are reviewed and judged according to procedures resulting in judgments that seek to be just. And yet, when approaching the law is a potentially criminal act or puts one at risk of being criminalized, detained, and expelled, then the law's mode of containment, internal expulsion through carceral means, become forms of legal violence. And under these conditions, justice is not furnished by law, but requires reading against the law to form a judgment, to call for sanctuary, to take critical action, to make collective a form of noncompliance in which we can all engage. Calling for abolition, by which is meant a way of imagining the world emancipated from such systems of legal violence, keeps a wild hope alive, supported by the imagination in a time when hope is targeted and expectations of justice regularly undermined. Kafka's fictions, though not calls for action, are experiments in time and space, giving form to that apparently implacable desire for justice, even as they foreground the bar against its realization. Parables cannot give us a plan, but they hold together the most pessimistic critique with the most riven, improbable, capacious passion for resistance and for justice. Holding a searing paradox, we feel what the law has become, but that process is not over. And to be Brechtian about it, this is where you enter the scene. Thank you. Thank you.
I think we have time for a few questions. There are mics at the back. The mics at the back. Hands are invisible. So please line up. Hope for the best.
You ready? Ready, I guess. I don't know if it's on. You hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
Okay. So thank you for your talk. I wanted to just focus in on your reading of Kafka. And one word that I don't think I heard was capital.
Say it again.
Capital.
Capital.
That's capital. So,
Yeah.
and thinking about the centrality of work to Kafka's texts, one way I used to, kind of thinking about it is that, variations of legal violence, variations of capitalist violence would be a good way to think of Kafka's text. And I wanted to ask you if you, saw that, of how you would approach that reading, as if that's a reading that you reject for Kafka, or in particular Der Prozess, and whether that would be in tension with the reading that you offered.
Not necessarily in tension, because it turns out that that one confusion that Joseph K. and Gregor Samsa both have is whether the apparent authorities who have entered their homes and who send them into unemployment are members, are representatives of their workplace, or if they are in fact police. And so what one sees is a confusion between industry and police, which I think is quite important. And I think one could obviously understand that there's a policing function of capitalism, and especially in the case of the Metamorphosis, a kind of critique of inefficiency. You failed to show up for work, you are fired. You can't possibly go to work in this terrible non-human form. So work is everywhere in Kafka's fiction, and being subject to owners of businesses or enterprises is a form of subjugation that is also a kind of policing. I think there's also the question of surveillance, and we could extrapolate, like, what about surveillance industries? These rogues who enter, who's paying them? So, I mean, it's definitely there. There's no question in my mind. I'm not sure I would accept it as the only framework in which to understand the operation of legal violence, but breaking the worker, which is what happens time and again in Kafka's work, is important. It's interesting to me that, one very often ends one of these parables or legal fictions standing back and saying, wow, like, why wasn't there an uprising? Like, why wasn't there a general strike? Like, why are people living under this? But I think that the fictions show how that world can become a closed world in such a way that the thought of strike, the thought of uprising is foreclosed. So, and it's almost like the fiction gives you the logic through which strike and uprising are foreclosed. So what is the normalization of the potential criminality of all workers? What is there's also an efficiency metric, as it were, that's there as well. Many things to be said about that. I thank you for the question.
Shall I? Yes?
Yes, please.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Nadia Ali. I'm a professor of anthropology and Middle East studies here at Brown. So over 20 years ago, after the invasion of Iraq, when there was a spike in gender-based violence, many of the feminist activists I talked to bemoaned the lawlessness, the general lawlessness that had been sort of increased following the invasion. And they very much tried to, get the government to criminalize different forms of gender-based violence, and they celebrated it. And of course, that didn't mean the end, but there were some improvements. Meanwhile, I mean, you referred to it. I mean, I grew up in Germany with the awareness that basically the Holocaust was legal in the eyes of Germans. So, and to my mind, this globally, we see this contradiction in you reference the US a lot. My question to you is, so what are the conditions, if any, in which the law is more in the service of justice? I mean, now I know in the current context here, it works both ways. In many contexts, it works both ways. But I feel like this, the conditions, in some ways, we cannot really analyze or understand without your question or the title of this talk, who are these men anyway? or actually, who are these men and these women anyway,
Yeah,
right? Sadly. So I was wondering whether you can reflect a little bit on are there certain conditions and who are these people? And then I guess, in terms of, in the spirit of, okay, what can we do about it? I mean, it seems to me that I've just witnessed this argument between a Palestinian friend of mine who's an anthropologist and international lawyer, and my Palestinian friend saying, what has international law given the Palestinians? We don't, it has not done anything, and it's useless. And the international lawyer saying, but we need international law. It gives us something, okay? And I could see both sides of the argument. And so I guess in the current moment here, I feel like, okay, we recognize the limitations of law, but we still need to use it, right? So what are sort of strategies of, on the one hand, recognizing it's never going to be enough. It's not a kind of liberal, okay, we just need the legal rights and we're okay. But, what are the sort of strategies? Sorry, these were like 3 questions folded in one.
Yes, there are many questions.
Sorry.
No, I think you might have your own paper to deliver at a certain point soon. But thank you. Let me just say, I didn't mention the problem of carceral feminism, but I think we do need to address carceral feminism, which puts faith in the punitive powers of the law and the criminalization procedures of the law to achieve feminist aims, and which also invariably relies on the state to administer justice in ways that I think need to be rethought. And I think carceral feminism has to be thought in terms of its racial politics as well, and in light of that importance of the abolitionist movement as outlined by Angela Davis and Ruthie Gilmore and other people, Beth Ritchie, many people who've been struggling with this issue. So, and they're not against the use of law itself. I mean, obviously civil rights are really important to maintain, and I would also say international human rights, even when proved to be ineffective or differentially applied, need to be revised and retained, because as we see, the attacks on the International Criminal Court are significant. I mean, people can say, well, International Criminal Court doesn't do anything. It can't enforce its judgments. But it's a space where the judgment gets made. What if we had no space? What if that judgment were never made public? And we don't know to what extent it will be actualized in time, or maybe it is being cited and actualized. It produces a precedent that seems to me useful. So I think there are a lot of criticisms of international law, but I would certainly not be opposed to it as such. The debates among Palestinians about international law are totally interesting, and they should be aired. That's been a debate going on for a very long time, and it's a fecund one. So I'm in favor of that happening. I'm interested, on the one hand, I'm appalled that so much of politics has become about litigation. I'm utterly appalled that we have now been brought into litigiousness by virtue of all these decrees and these statutes and these horrible laws and the denial of so many legal rights, including rights related to reproductive justice, trans legal rights, including rights to affirmative gender, healthcare for youth, the banning of books, the deconstituting rights for migrants. We have so many forms of rights destruction or rights stripping going on that we're spending a lot of time calling upon progressive legal associations to get injunctions and to stop the enforcement of these right-stripping activities. It's absolutely necessary work, and I've never been more grateful for progressive lawyers in my life. I mean, if you just look at what Palestine Legal is doing, if you look at the Center for Constitutional Rights, if you look at the lawyers helping the American Association of University Professors. I mean, there's so many Lawyers Guild, they're Democracy Forward. I mean, we can name them. They are working full time. ACLU has turned out to be a much more reliable ally than I remembered from my youth. And, but, you know, I mean, they're doing great work. But lawsuits are not the same. Wendy Brown says lawsuits will never pave the way to revolution. And that's right. They're not emancipatory practices, although they can establish freedoms. But we need to keep the discussion of justice to some degree separate from these legal accomplishments that are also necessary. Because the question of how to politically organize the world and according to what principles, those are questions of politics that are not necessarily questions of law. They're also questions of justice that are not reducible to law. So keeping the space of politics open and separable from law seems absolutely important. I think it would be terrible if all political questions got reduced to legal ones. We would be, I think, lost. We'd lose our way. I don't think that answers your good question, but I did my best.
Okay, we have time for one more very quick question.
I hope it's a good one.
And that will be you. Yes.
So you say, to be excluded from the law does not mean to be free of the law. One can be jettisoned from the law but subject indefinitely to its course. And there's two kind of examples from the lecture about this. One being the circuit towards the courthouse resembling the Jewish quarter, and the other being, for example, DACA children brought into the United States having no potential path towards legal status. I say that these two are examples of being born outside the provenance of a legal system. And other than the Constitution being put above, quote unquote, national security, how can a legal system ethically uphold justice for people born outside of its jurisdiction? And then more loftily, can ethical systems exist parallel to national boundaries or extend to those born outside the social contract? Or is this where justice, not reducible to law, must step in? Thank you.
Thank you. There's a lot in that question, too. And then the question is, how do I do justice to a question that has several components? And I fear failure. So let's see what I can do here. First of all, you've given a couple of good examples. I mean, people who come to the border, if you think about the detention camps that line the southern border of the United States, and they are detention camps, those people are approaching the law and they are detained by the law. They have they're not empowered by that law. They're not even given, for the most part, a timely communication about when they will be heard. Some of them have been waiting for months and months, if not years. So they're subject to a law at the same time, and its punitive exclusionary powers at the same time that they're approaching that law. That's different from, of course, undocumented people inside the country, or those who have understood themselves to be documented, who are finding that their documents are not being accepted as such, right? Who are in the process legally of going through a documentation, only to find that they're being criminalized for being in that process. That's a different situation. And the DACA issue is, of course, yet another one where there's an understanding that you do have, or has been an understanding of provisional legal status, only to find that it's being denied or stripped from you. So these are all distinct, and I think we could come up with many more examples than these. I do think that to find them unjust, we may find laws. If we're a lawyer, we may find laws, alternate laws that we can use to contest those policies, and that's a good thing, and I'm in favor of that. But ultimately, the laws we use and the laws we oppose require a form of judgment that the law itself, unless you're a legal positivist, and I'm obviously not, the law itself cannot provide. In other words, there is a sphere of judgment that belongs to our political life, and it's not just an individual judgment. It's a judgment that we come up with together that belongs to a justice, a pursuit of justice that has to be not just national, but transnational. So, because there is no border politics, there's no migration politics that is not by definition transnational. If we stay within the nation state and come up with our immigration policy, we're redrawing the border rather than asking what the border should be or what our responsibilities are across borders to one another, regardless of nationality. So it seems to me that a just migration policy is by definition transnational, and as such would apply to a variety of different legal regimes or different legal systems. So it would have to be to some degree extra legal in its aspiration. So I guess I'm making the case for the transnational and extra legal approach to justice that would help us find our way in relationship to these legal systems that are partially, if not fully, criminal.
And on that note, thank you.